name's Natalie. I'm a consultant in public health and I'm co-chair of the Faculty of Public Health Sexual and Reproductive Health Special Interest Group. Today is the start with the first of our lunch and learn sessions. So this is going to be a series of presentations on sexual and reproductive health topics through a public health lens and how these relate to clinical practice. So very kindly, Dr. Theeba Krishnamoorthy has joined us, and she's going to be giving a presentation on her own research on decolonizing post-colonial sexuality education, what implications this has for sexual health educators, service providers in the British-Sri Lankan context. The presentation will last about 30 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. And please do put any questions or comments in the chat also. But Theeba, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Natalie. So hi everyone, my name's Theeba. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of East London, and I'm also a locum doctor at Luton and Dunstable Hospital. So thank you for having me here today to speak at your very first lunch and learn session. Today I'll findings. And my PhD was focused on looking at sexuality educational experiences of young Sri Lankan Tamils in the UK within the context of their sexuality stories. Could I have the slides up, please? Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, my PhD explored the sexuality educational experiences of young Sri Lankan Tamils in the UK within the context of their sexuality stories. My motivation for the topic stemmed from at in near absent sexuality education and a curiosity around how others in my community may have fared from this as well. So the next slide. So in 2019, as I'm sure you're well aware, the Department for Education published a new guidance for sex education, updating it for the first time in 20 years. The new guidance makes progress in many ways. To name a few, there was a shift towards a compulsory relationships education in primary school and compulsory relationships education in secondary schools, timely menstrual education, the shift toward inclusivity. However, the guidance continued to cater for parental rights to withdraw their child from sex education, as well as catering for religious ethos of schools. Despite these, the new guidance was received with mixed reactions from various members of the public, bringing sexuality education's historical and controversial status within the UK and globally back to the forefront. All the while, the voices of young British South Asians were absent from this debate. To give you some context, South Asians make up one of the largest ethnic minority groups, around 5% of the population in England and Wales. Yet there is a paucity of sexuality research in this group. This may be in part due to reluctance around exploring such a culturally taboo subject in this community, for which I do have a few experiences myself as a researcher. It could also be because the most robust and reliable data we have at present, NatCell2 dataset from the year 2000, has highlighted that the two largest groups within South Asian diaspora, Indians and Pakistanis, have a low sexual risk behavior relative to other ethnic groups, for which reason South Asian diaspora may not have been considered a public health priority. However, the NatCell2 dataset is now over 2 decades old, and we have more recent studies showing that the subsequent generation of South Asian diaspora are more sexually active than their parent counterparts. And the dataset also only represented 2 of the largest subgroups within the South Asian diaspora, so Indians and Pakistanis, and neglected the remaining smaller groups such as the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you some context on the population I studied, the Sri Lankan diaspora originated from the teardrop island of Sri Lanka, formerly known as Ceylon, located south of India. They have a distinctive socio-economic. They are also a heterogeneous group encompassing many languages, many ethnicities, many religions, classes, castes, genders, sexual orientations. And in this thesis, I focused predominantly on, focused only on the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, of which 200,000. Sri Lankan Tamils have a Sri Lankan Tamils have a long settlement history here in the UK since gaining their independence in the 1940s. The largest migration wave was during the time of rising ethnic tension and the subsequent civil war in Sri Lanka. However, the relationship between Sri Lanka and UK, as well as Europe, long predates this by a few centuries, during which time Ceylon was under Portuguese colonial rule, followed by Dutch, and then finally the British colonial rule. So although Sri Lankan Tamils are a significantly sized diaspora here in the UK, they're not captured as a pre-designated ethnic group. And for that reason, they are somewhat neglected population in terms of health research and demographic research. In line with this, my scoping review, which mapped existing sexuality research and the wider West, had identified also limited studies. Most of the published studies focused on married women and were often limited to first generation. This lack of diversity of participants in the limited studies that have taken place makes it difficult for academics and researchers to challenge the dominant sexual norm within the Sri Lankan diaspora of reproductive marital heterosexuality. Bear in mind that this is by no means unique to Sri Lankan Tamils. This norm does exist in other diaspora groups. But the lack of diversity of participants makes it difficult to challenge that norm, but also to generate new knowledge that accurately reflects the diversity of Sri Lankan Tamil sexualities. So given this limitation in past research of Sri Lankan Tamils in the West and the changing sexuality behaviours of younger people in the wider South Asian diaspora here in the UK, there was clearly a need for sexuality research in the subsequent generations to understand how people navigate being raised in a hybridized environment belonging to both the Sri Lankan Tamil and the British environment, particularly for those whose voices are often missed in academia, so unmarried women, trans people, and queer people of Sri Lankan Tamil background. Next slide, please. So for this study, I gathered sexuality stories. Stories I find to be very powerful resources. They not only offer a window into our own inner lives, but they also shine a light out into the world, illuminating the wider public issues. Stories have the potential to generate imagination and create a culture of hope, but they also have the potential to harm through silencing. So when stories of differences are left unheard or untold, we are left without the imagery or the vocabulary to make sense of a diverse society. So for this reason, I focused on a storytelling approach, prioritizing young Sri Lankan Tamils who are often othered or excluded from the diaspora. So through stories, participants were able to contextualize their sexuality educational experiences within the broader context of their biography, the wider society, and the history as they deemed fit to tell. So in this study, I had 8 Sri Lankan Tamils who were included. They were born or predominantly raised in the UK of ages between 18 to 29. Participants identified their gender as man, woman, genderqueer, and trans non-binary. Their sexual orientations as homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, and androsexual. 2 of them were in a relationship at the time. The remainder identified as being single. Interestingly, none of the participants who had come forward to take part in the studies were married. The sexuality stories themselves were analysed using a combination of structural and thematic analysis. And to offer another perspective, semi-structured interviews were also conducted with community participants. So parents, teachers, both mainstream school and Tamil school, and community-based organisation employees. And these were analysed using thematic analysis. Next slide. Thank you. So from gathering these stories and hearing how the participants themselves contextualize their own sexuality educational experiences within their stories, it kind of became evident that I needed to invest in a new pair of glasses, for example, to understand the way in which I viewed my world, but also my own diaspora. A lens that required me to understand, that made me realize that in order to understand my present society, I needed to have an understanding of our collective past, a lens for which I'm really grateful to my participants for enlightening me with, as well as my supervisors. So just to share a part of that with you guys. So Sri Lankan Tamil sexualities can be traced through colonialism and also post-colonialism. This includes the meaning and in some instances, the total invention of some concepts. So race, gender, sexuality, familial and societal dynamics. And as such, adopting a post-colonial feminist outlook was necessary because the Sri Lankan Tamil young people in the UK were not simply Sri Lankan Tamil plus British or the equal merger of two spaces or two identities. They were the product of a complicated, multi-sided colonial legacy embedded within an unequal power dynamic that spans across geography and time. Next slide, please. So this process began in colonial Ceylon. Many academics have argued that there was an existence of a pre-colonial South with diverse and multiple gender and sexualities. However, these Eastern sexualities were viewed by the West as uncivilized and immoral, or as conservative and oppressive, which justified their pursuit of the East. The pursuit where colonizers traumatized, distorted, disrupted, and simplified pre-colonial nations for their own personal gains. And this was done through violent colonial interventions, such as introduction of homophobic laws, criminalization of non-marital sex, Christianization of colonized people, sexual violence, sexualities between Europeans and non-Europeans that were often coerced, basically ultimately disrupting the very fabric of community life. The idea of acceptable gender and sexual roles then continued to be reformulated post-independence through ethno-nationalism, war, migration, and then subsequently the settlement in their new host countries. And then finally, the young people who then did end up here found themselves being caught between competing patriarchies of the Sri Lankan Tamils and the British, which is particularly problematic for those, as post-colonial scholar Spivak would put it, are doubly colonized by being in both power structures. So this would be women, trans people, and queer people of color. Next slide. So having set the context, here are the results of my PhD study. So my analysis of the sexuality stories revealed two main themes around the evolving sexuality education across the life course of these young people. So firstly, as you can see on your left, is the childhood experiences of sexuality education. And then on the right is the second theme, which is the sexuality education that young people then went on to seek later in their adult lives in safe spaces. And I'll expand upon these in the coming slide. So next slide. So the first of the two findings I want to share with you today is this: during childhood, restricted sexuality education was experienced across the two dominant cultural spaces. By that, I mean the Sri Lankan Tamil space, so home, cultural events, Tamil friendship groups, weekend Tamil classes, and then there's the English space, such as primary school, secondary school. It's not my intent to reduce these two cultural spaces as polar opposites, so like Sri Lankan Tamil versus British, but rather to kind of reveal the similarities and the differences across these spaces. Next slide. So over the next few slides, I will present the experiences in childhood, which you see on the slide, and then followed by the impact of this restrictive education on the sexual life and identities of young Sri Lankan Tamils. So all the participants in the study have been assigned new Tamil pseudonyms rather than a code, so that these experiences are real people with real lives. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first feature of the childhood experiences of sexuality education was so this feature refers to how sexuality education was marginalized in the different spaces that young people occupied. So in the Sri Lankan Tamil spaces, participants reported an absence of discussion and a withdrawal from class-based sexuality education. Other core subjects are treated where extra tuition provision is offered for core subjects. The difficulty to talk about sexuality was not just limited to adults, but it also existed between young people. And this paralleled the difficulty that community participants. Sorry, is there internet problems?
It's just cut out a few times.
Oh, not sure how to.
Might help turning your camera off, potentially.
Let me know if that continues. Thanks. So this parallel the difficulties faced by community participants themselves in acquiring sexuality education. However, do not think that this reluctance to address sexuality education was limited necessarily to the Sri Lankan Tamil spaces, because participants reported a similarly weak position of sexuality education in their experiences at school. Research, for instance, participants only received 1 or 2 sessions in sexuality education at school, and there was also an absence of discussing sexuality education in core curricular subjects where there were obvious overlaps in topics such as history. Next slide, please. Thank you. The second feature, 2 times. Oh, is it still going on? Doesn't usually happen. Not sure what to do. Any suggestions?
We can turn our cameras off and see if that helps.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the second feature was the narrow agenda received through sexuality education was often limited to heterosexuality, reproduction as the purpose of sex, and pathology. In the English educational spaces, young participants reported that sexuality education was predominantly restricted to biology and reported to be delivered too late on basic biological information regarding their bodies, for instance, learning about periods in a timely manner, absent teaching around external female genitalia and female pleasure. Non-heterosexual, non-binary and transgendered participants missed out on knowledge. This was somewhat similar to the Sri Lankan Tamil space, wherein the little education that was given was also delivered late and restricted to talks around biology. For instance, one participant received their puberty talk on wet dreams later than they needed at the age of 15 from his uncle, and then at the age of 22 from his father. Participants who were not male, who were not heterosexual, not cisgendered, reported that narrow agenda ill-prepared them, leaving them vulnerable, and the knowledge offered in both spaces left many questions unanswered for young participants, which resulted in them seeking alternate sources such as pornography. They also felt to be problematic as well. Next slide. Thank you. The third feature of the restrictive childhood sexuality educational experiences was adult-centered. to seek permission of adults to be able to attend sexuality education at schools. Sorry, is the internet working again?
It does keep cutting out.
God, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'll continue. Adults would often have to, so young people would often have to seek permission of adults to be able to attend sexuality education at school. And also adults were in charge across the spaces on what knowledge was deemed necessary for young people to know, of limiting the knowledge to the narrow agenda of reproduction and pathology. The education was often a one-way street, wherein the role of knowledge was in the minds of students. And if young people had any questions that they wanted to ask that was outside the remit of that narrow agenda, adults would try to deflect or avoid answering altogether, further reinforcing that narrow agenda again. Once again, this left young life in a well-informed manner. Next slide. Thanks. The fourth and final feature was that policing happens in most places. So this feature describes how sexuality behaviors must be restricted to a standard dominant set governed by society's wider prescriptive gender and heteronormative values and rules that were explicitly relayed in the Sri Lankan Tamil spaces, yet implicitly supported in the English spaces through their silence and unwillingness to validate behaviors outside the norms. Defying these values risk shame, stigma, or intensification of violence against those who dare to challenge the rules. For instance, being slut-shamed for visible female sexuality, homophobic bullying, and being sent away for conversion therapy for exhibiting feminine traits as a man. With only masculine heterosexuality being permitted, and even that was often within a narrow window of early or hypersexuality. Next slide. This restrictive experience of sexuality education at childhood failed most of these participants as children and as young people. They were failed at school, at home, at places of worship, by their community, and by the media. Next slide. For these young participants reported that the restricted sexuality educational experiences across the spaces in childhood were centered on privileging male heterosexuality and the associated invisible female sexuality as being natural, with the explicit and implicit pedestaling of marital reproductive heterosexuality across the spaces. For example, Agil, a cis heterosexual male, relayed in his narrative how he naturally navigated his sexuality at the age of 15, finding a partner, entering a relationship, having sexual intercourse. The ease of navigation was such that the school-based sexuality education curriculum was felt to be redundant for him. Whereas the remaining sexualities, be it visible female sexuality, queer sexuality, homosexuality, these were branded as being transgressive and actively silenced by external sources or silenced internally within themselves. In order to embrace one's sexuality, young participants, and in particular those who were subjected to those multiple layers of marginalization, such as women, queer people, and trans people of color, needed to sever their sexuality from their ethnic identity in order to be able to seemingly move between the two identities depending on which space they were occupying at the time. Because at the time there was no visible example of individuals where their ethnicity and their non-normative sexualities coexisting in the community. So participants did this at the time by creating an illusion of a good Sri Lankan Tamil. So examples of this would be Anber, who pulled the best show-stopping performance ever to convince others he was not gay. Kanna, who initially kept her relationship a secret from her parents due to the risk of societal judgment and alienation had they known that she engaged in premarital relations. Another way participants created this illusion of a good Sri Lankan Tamil was to leave both cultural spaces altogether and to explore their sexuality identity in the safety of distance. So one example of that would be to explore their sexuality on online spaces, such as escorting websites or apps like Grindr, or seeking universities away from their home, or moving out the family home entirely. Next slide. However, the sexuality stories of these participants don't end here. The sexuality stories kind of extend beyond these images of risk and harm and evolved into capturing images of strength, resilience, and resistance, which leads me to the second main theme I want to share, and that's a theme of hope, wherein the young Sri Lankan Tamil participants did not wholly internalize the restrictions of their early childhood sexuality educational experiences, and the divide between one's sexuality and ethnicity did not persist. Rather, these participants adopted a critical stance that enabled them to liberate their mind from the restrictions of their childhood sexuality experiences and heal the division between their Sri Lankan Tamil identities with their sexualities in new safe spaces in adulthood. Next slide. Safe spaces were desired, sought, trialed, or created in the quest for a better tailored sexuality educational experience. These spaces, which I explore as decolonial, looked beyond the white colonial patriarchal heteronormativity to recognize the plurality of difference, such as gender, sexual orientation, and race, whilst also dismantling the power relations that exist between these differences, offering hope amidst the harshness of reality. The core elements of these new safe spaces included the following themes, which I'll expand on in the coming slides. So reconnecting with spirituality and culture, returning to a collective, engaged discussions, and teaching as a decolonial practice. Next slide. So the new spaces offered young participants to explore a more individualistic path, deviating from the dominant cultural religious discourse. Participants sought new hidden cultural and religious stories of difference in which their sexuality and ethnicity divide could heal. So they embraced stories from a pre-colonial gender and sexually fluid times. So an example of that would be the ancient Tamil literature Silappatikaram that spoke of trans women, myths of queer gods and goddesses such as Meenakshi Amman, who is the child of two male gods born with 3 breasts. These past tales demonstrates a defiance to the belief that Eastern religions and cultures are backwards relative to Western Christianity and cultures. Other participants also commented on how seeing themselves in contemporary Tamil culture, although the examples were limited, aided bridging the division between their sexuality and cultural identity. For instance, the mainstream Tamil movie Kanjana, which explores the life of a transgender woman, and the South Indian female actress Silk Smitha, famed for her unapologetically visible female sexuality in South Indian cinema, revealing that both in the past and present, there have and are examples where the ethnicity and sexuality have coexisted. Next slide. Thank you. Returning to a collective was expressed in several of the narratives of young participants who have cautiously attempted to return to their diaspora to reconcile their divide between sexuality and ethnicity. So several participants identified local organizations dedicated to issues of sexuality that predominantly cater for people of color as safe spaces that offered them the opportunity to be part of a collective. One account that demonstrates this is that of Kanna, a heterosexual woman. Following the end of her first relationship, Kanna felt that she had gone against the cultural expectation of a woman. As she said in her own words, that you're kind of not meant to have these sexual experiences as a Tamil person before marriage. However, it was in engaging in conversation with other women in the organization that Kanna was able to challenge the dominant discourse that premarital sexual experiences are abnormal and shameful, particularly for women. In Kanna's opinion, this younger diasporic space allowed for meaningful engagement and knowledge or experience exchange at a deeper level, wherein the taboo subject could be openly discussed, a conversation that she could not have had in the past in her own home space or in her earlier relationship. Engaging in these conversations helped her realize that she was not only was she not alone in these experiences, but that she was able to finally unlearn those negative connotations associated with premarital sexuality. Next slide. Quality of communication between individuals in the safe spaces that young participants sought. Young participants sought new spaces where teachings went beyond the mere deposition of facts and rather encouraged participants to connect own lived experiences so as to share in this intellectual and spiritual growth of one another. One account that demonstrates this is that of Tamils, a heterosexual woman. She attended a university talk where a South Asian professional shared her personal account of the. So Tamil, having been raised in a family where language around abuse was obscured or absent, hearing this narrative from another South Asian woman validated her own personal experiences of intimate partner violence. Following the talk, there was a discussion group alone in her revelations, because it appeared that the rest of the group was very dismissive of the content, claiming that that discussions around abuse is irrelevant to relationship. It was due to this main speaker taking the risk to share her own narrative of abuse and being vulnerable herself, which empowered Tamil to then speak up for the very first time and share her past experiences of being in an abusive relationship to the rest of the group. And encouraged university colleagues to recognize that abuse in relationships is still an ongoing issue today. So this account emphasizes the value of student-centered techniques such as discussion groups and the importance of young participants reconnecting with other members in the share in order to be able to have a greater understanding of the different realities that currently exist within the diaspora. Next slide. So this is the final theme, decolonial practice. In this theme, a select few of the participants took it upon themselves to go forth and become creators of their own safe space, where they delivered a more meaningful sexuality education to other young people in the diaspora. One such account as being so open about everything, having since come out of her first long-term and difficult relationship. So Inbar delivered a range of talks, including one at a Tamil event where she discussed a range of sexuality issues. To deliver such as a never married woman, Inbar went to challenge the dominant discourse of silence, secrecy, and shame that surrounds sexuality, as well as the patriarchal colonial expectation that a woman must not think or talk about matters of sexuality. The significance of her identity as a married was evident in the reactions of other women within that seminar that she delivered her talk at. For these women approached Inbar later to express their appreciation of seeing a woman in their community speak up on matters of sexuality. And talking about sexuality, Inbar went to carve out a safe space to enable meaningful engagement and exchange lived experiences with other Tamils in the session. And collectively, they were allowed to actually challenge that dominant discourse of shame, secrecy, and silence on those matters. So this study identified the nuanced ways in which sexuality education can restrict but also liberate young people from the dominant discourses of marital reproductive heterosexuality. And in light of post-colonial feminist perspective. And what fascinated me most was the image of hope, which was revealed through how participants decolonized the post-colonial sexuality educational experiences they received earlier in life. What I mean by that is that the restrictive childhood spaces were viewed by most participants to be constructed through an ongoing process of coloniality, wherein education received restricted and constrained the way young participants could navigate their sexuality across the spaces, resulting in the marginalized full spectrum of sexuality among the Sri Lankan Tamils. This left most of the participants feeling that marital reproductive heterosexuality was the only livable sexuality, or in order to be able to embrace your sexuality, you had no choice but to sever ties with your ethnicity. The research participants adopted a decolonial approach later on by carving out alternate ways of knowing and living their sexual lives, demonstrating strength, resilience, and resistance in their stories as they sought to create their own safe spaces, to liberate their mind from the restrictive, non-normative sexualities livable alongside ethnic identities. Next slide. Thanks. So this study has a number of strengths and limitations. Key strengths included the storytelling approaches, as well as disrupting the researcher-participant power dynamic as the participants primarily led the interviews. Also being a bilingual speaking researcher, I found enhanced the interview process. Key limitations include the small sample size, which means the experiences of the sexuality Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora as a whole. Furthermore, the research is specific to the context of Britain, as such may not be generalizable to other Western countries that host Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora. Next slide. Thanks. Going forward, firstly, there is a need for a post-colonial feminist approach to understanding the experiences of Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora and possibly other post-colonial diaspora as well. Secondly, the study also argues for the decolonization of sexuality education, be it education at school or at home, in the clinic, at places of worship, so as to better provide for young people of Sri Lankan Tamil background with knowledge and skills to build livable sexual lives and identities, so that we can give them the best start to their sexual lives, rather than leaving them all alone in the hopes that they will make their discovery at some point later in life. This urges us to stop our intense focus on the restrictive discourse of reproductive heterosexuality and the pathologies of sex, and move towards a more broader conceptualization of sexuality that includes pleasure, desire, abuse, racism, coercion. It also stresses the need to look beyond the white colonial patriarchal heteronormativity and share alternate ways of being and living our sexual lives. One example would be for sexuality education to be spiritually and culturally relevant by remembering and sharing stories of difference that have been lost to the past. And this could strengthen young Sri Lankan Tamils' health. Another example would be to adopt a cross-curricular approach to sexuality education, so as to include sexuality topics in other relevant subject areas, so religious studies, history class, Tamil class. This would facilitate young people to appreciate the socially constructed. And lastly, the study argues for the provision of discrete, easy and supportive avenues for seeking information, guidance and sexual health services for young Sri Lankan Tamils whose sexuality falls outside of that marital reproductive heterosexuality imperative, and ensuring the maintenance of confidentiality. Improving service providers' awareness and understanding of the social cultural sensitivities around Sri Lankan Tamil sexual experiences can enable professionals to be responsive to the young Sri Lankan Tamils' questions and requests in relation to limited and often negative representations of sexuality, particularly for women, trans people and queer people, enhancing the service user experience. Next slide. In summary, our sexuality education across the spaces in the past has denied the full diverse spectrum of young people's sexualities, and at best have reduced young people's sexuality, ill preparing young people to have a safe, fulfilling and pleasurable sexual experience, free from coercion, discrimination and violence. In particular for women, trans people and queer people of colour. We can continue to turn a blind eye, or we can take the challenge and to own this issue and to change the situation. All we need to do is the work to unearth the different and diverse stories erased from our past and listen to stories of difference in our present. Make an attempt to broaden our awareness and knowledge of the diverse social representations of sexuality that exist within our community and in the general population, and share this with others. Each one of us can make a small difference in our homes, in our schools, in our workplace, to eradicate this cloud of shame and stigma that surrounds the plurality of sexualities. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Theeba. Such an interesting and just rich piece of research. That was really, really interesting. So thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I had a question, if that's okay. Thanks, Theeba. I really, really enjoyed that. I was just wondering about how you recruited, where you found people willing to talk to you, and how you went about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. It was a long process, actually. So initially, what I did was to create a leaflet and to send it out through social media and through grassroots organizations that I'm aware of. And that's where I got some of the participants, and then from there on it snowballed. I think the interesting part for me was the fact that the type of people that I encouraged to come forward, so the fact that people whose voices aren't often heard were the ones who were very keen to come and to speak up, whereas those who were married or who I guess society would deem have social currency, so being married, having children, they didn't come forward for the study. So I found that to be an interesting difference in those who did want to be recruited and who didn't want to be recruited.
Okay, so it was wide, that anybody, married or not, could. It was just the fact that it happened to be those people that were single that came forward. And
exactly. So initially the idea was to open the sexuality stories up for young people between the ages of 18 and 29. So that's how, so young people in Sri Lanka are defined up to the age of 29. So that's why I kept the bracket quite open. And I left it to the young people to decide who would want to come forward and who didn't. But if there was going to be a large turnout, then I would prioritize the people who don't often get their voices heard. But it seemed like it was self-selective. It was people who don't get their voices heard who actually wanted to come forward.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. It's really interesting, actually, that it turned out that way, that the people that we don't hear from very much actually are the ones who wanted to make their voices heard, which is really a positive thing.
Yeah, it took me by surprise, but it was a very welcome surprise. I really appreciated those people coming forward.
Yeah, definitely. So I was actually going to ask you, was there anything that surprised you? You kind of answered that question just now. But I guess is that the thing that most surprised you in conducting this research, or is there something else that came up that you just really weren't expecting?
That was the first surprise. And thanks to that surprise, the next surprise for me was probably the whole dive into colonialism and understanding my own heritage and positionality a lot better. So that's something I didn't really know before the PhD. I mean, you hear words now and then in the community saying, oh, this is inherited from the Portuguese, this word is inherited from the Dutch, but didn't really make much connection in the past, given that the community was more focused on the current civil war. So it was interesting to learn from the participants about how colonialism plays a role in the conflict that we internally feel for being both Sri Lankan, but also being of British heritage at the same time, and how it can be problematic because any progress that we do on the Western Front can seem like we are shunning away our Sri Lankan side. And it was interesting to learn about all those dynamics and to be able to see that some of the reactions that you get for things you do in your life isn't really as personal, it's probably wider. So I guess the whole storytelling process, it was just shining a light out to the wider public issues that I was blind to in the past, which now I feel like I've got a clearer image thanks to all that knowledge. That was a bit of a babble. I hope that made sense.
That did. No, thank you. It's a really interesting perspective to hear, I think, as well, and that kind of conflict that can occur between two cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think is fascinating. I guess that has implications for other ethnic minority groups.
Yeah, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
I think especially for those who work within the medical field as well, because there's that whole history with medicine and colonialism as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you're kind of conflict on multiple fronts when you're coming back into your own community, because you don't know what way people are viewing you as, how Western you are, or how Sri Lankan Tamil you are. It's interesting to learn about all those dynamics.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting what you said about kind of coming back into your community and how people view you. I think that was something that I thought about actually during COVID, and how people perceive you as a medical professional from an ethnic minority group, and how that impacts your credibility in terms of delivering messages and things like that. Was something that struck me during that time. So it's just, yeah, interesting you say that. I think, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it is. One that can take forever to unpack.
Yeah, it's complex for sure. Definitely. Okay. Are there any other questions, comments?
I was just going to ask one other thing, if that's okay. I was just interested. You said it was like a storytelling approach, rather than like semi-structured interviews or anything. So was it just literally tell me your story, tell me about your experience of like sexuality, and then they just told you whatever they wanted about that? Or
so initially it was supposed to be a semi-structured, but I trialed it once and it just really didn't sit well with me because I felt like it was so forced. But then I had another researcher who is technically called biographic narrative interpretive method.
okay,
I prefer saying storytelling, it's much nicer.
yeah.
And it kind of sits in line with a medical interview in the sense that you ask that one open question and then you don't interrupt.
Okay.
Ask follow-up questions based only on what the story was, what they shared in that story. Then the third part is where you then have follow-up questions of your own interest. But the primary part is the first and the second. And that can take anything from like maybe 10, 20 minutes to about an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So yeah, it was literally like that. I just said, tell me your story, tell me whatever you want, whichever part you're interested in. I'm here just to listen and make notes. And then they just told me their story, which was a much better, it flowed much better.
Yeah.
For most of the participants, it flowed better. Some of them, it was a new approach, being allowed to speak for so long. Try and get the process going. Thank you.
That's really fascinating. I haven't heard of that method before. That's really interesting.
Neither did I until that moment. But yeah, it's definitely an
Brilliant. Okay, well, if there are no other questions or comments, then Theeba, thank you so much for sharing your research with us, and for sharing your time with us. And it's been a pleasure. It's been really enjoyable and interesting to listen to. So thank you very, very much. So yeah, I think we can stop recording and close the session. Thank you.